The Crimean Peninsula in the autumn of 1854 was a contradiction written in blood and geography, a narrow spit of land jutting into the Black Sea, fought over for millennia because it controlled the only warm water port accessible to Russia's southern fleets. To the north lay the vast Eurasian steppe, an ocean of grass that stretched unbroken to the Urals. To the south, the port of Sevastopol, perhaps the most heavily fortified naval base in the world, ringed by stone bastions and defended by 30,000 Russian troops who had spent the summer watching British, French, and Ottoman forces land on their shores with the explicit intention of destroying Russian naval power in the Black Sea. The war itself was a product of 19th century great power politics, ostensibly about protecting Christian minorities in Ottoman territory, actually about checking Russian expansion and maintaining the European balance of power that had held since Napoleon's defeat. The British Expeditionary Force had arrived in September, 27,000 men under the command of Lord Raglan, a Peninsula War veteran who had lost his right arm at Waterloo, and who now found himself commanding an army equipped with tactics and thinking from that earlier conflict. The French contributed 30,000 troops under Marshal Saint-Arnaud, who would die of cholera within weeks of landing. The Ottoman Empire provided token forces, more symbolic than militarily significant. Together, this coalition had besieged Sevastopol, investing the city from the south and settling into what would become one of the first modern siege operations, a grinding, attritional struggle that introduced the world to trench warfare, rifled muskets with effective ranges exceeding 300 yards, and the telegraph, which for the first time allowed war correspondents to transmit dispatches from the front lines to London newspapers within days. But the siege could not be sustained without supply lines, and those lines ran through the port of Balaclava, a small natural harbor on the southern coast of the peninsula, barely adequate for the tonnage required to feed and arm 30,000 men through a Crimean winter. The harbor itself was dominated by hills on three sides: the Fidyukin Heights to the north, the Causeway Heights running east to west, and to the south, the steep slopes that descended almost directly into the sea. The British had established their main supply base in the town, using the single rough road that climbed north toward the siege lines as their primary logistics artery. This road and the heights that commanded it became the strategic focus of the entire campaign. The Russians understood this perfectly. Prince Menshikov, commanding Russian forces in Crimea, could not break the siege directly. His attempts in September had been repulsed at the Alma River with heavy losses. But if he could seize Balaclava, cut the British supply line, and force Raglan to lift the siege or watch his army starve, he would achieve the same result without needing to storm prepared positions. On the morning of October 25th, Menshikov committed 25,000 infantry and 34 squadrons of cavalry to this objective, launching a three-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the thin screen of British cavalry and Turkish infantry defending the Causeway Heights, then drive down into Balaclava before the British could respond. The ground itself would shape what followed. The valley north of the Causeway Heights, soon to be immortalized as the Valley of Death, was a shallow depression perhaps 1.25 miles long and 3/4 mile wide, bounded by the Causeway Heights to the south and the Fedyukin Heights to the north. It was excellent cavalry country, relatively flat, firm ground suitable for massed formations, with clear fields of observation and fire. At its eastern end sat the Russian artillery and cavalry, perhaps 3,000 sabers supported by 12 guns. At the western end, scattered across the South Valley and positioned to defend Balaclava itself, were the British cavalry divisions, the Heavy Brigade under Brigadier General Scarlett and the Light Brigade under Major General the Earl of Cardigan, perhaps 700 mounted troops in total, supported by a single troop of Royal Horse Artillery. The disparity in numbers was stark enough, but there were other factors at play that morning, elements that did not appear in the tactical assessments or the intelligence reports compiled by British staff officers. The local Tatar population, Muslim Turkic peoples who had lived in Crimea for centuries had largely withdrawn from the combat zone, retreating into the interior or crossing to Ottoman territory. But before they left, some of them spoke to British cavalrymen through interpreters, warning them about the ground north of Balaclava. The warnings were fragmentary and filtered through linguistic and cultural barriers, but the essential message was consistent. The valley was Yer, unlucky ground, cursed ground, a place where riders disappeared and horses refused to go after dark. The Tatars had their own histories of this place, stories passed down through generations about cavalry that had fought there during the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, during the Ottoman-Russian wars of the 18th century, during conflicts so old that only the outline of events remained. They spoke of Golga Atliler, shadow riders, cavalry seen in peripheral vision during battles, formations that appeared and vanished like smoke, riders who left no tracks and cast no shadows even in direct sunlight. The British officers focused on more immediate concerns like ammunition supply and the positioning of artillery, gave these warnings no consideration. Local superstition, the sort of folklore that accumulates in any region with a long history of warfare. Nothing that would affect modern military operations conducted by professional soldiers using contemporary tactics. But the horses knew. Across the British cavalry lines, grooms and farriers reported unusual behavior from their mounts throughout the night of October 24th. The animals were restless, pulling at their tethers, ears constantly swiveling toward the valley to the north. Some refused to eat. Others became inexplicably agitated when led toward the causeway heights for watering, requiring force to compel them forward. Captain Lewis Nolan of the 15th Hussars, one of the most experienced cavalry officers in the British Army and a published authority on cavalry tactics, noted in his diary that his own mount, a steady mare that had carried him through multiple campaigns, had become almost unmanageable after midnight, requiring constant attention to prevent her from breaking her tether and bolting. He attributed it to the approaching battle, to some animal instinct that sensed violence coming. He was not entirely wrong. By dawn on the 25th, as Russian columns began their advance and British pickets galloped back with reports of enemy movement in strength, the stage was set for what would become one of the most analyzed military disasters in British history. But beneath the historical record, beneath the documented orders and counter-orders, the confusion and courage and catastrophic miscommunication, there was another pattern beginning to emerge, a pattern that had repeated itself on this ground before and would manifest again as the morning progressed. The valley north of Balaclava had been a killing ground for cavalry for 600 years, and some of those who had died there, it seemed, had never truly departed. The heavy brigade stood in column of squadrons, approximately 800 yards west of the Causeway Heights, when the first Russian cavalry appeared on the northern ridgeline. Brigadier General James Scarlett, 55 years old and relatively new to command of mounted troops despite decades of military service, watched through his field glasses as enemy formations crested the Fedyukin Heights and began descending into the valley. The Russian cavalry moved with the ponderous deliberation of a force that knew it possessed overwhelming numbers, 3,000 horsemen in dense columns, a mixture of regular dragoons and Cossack irregular cavalry, supported by artillery that was already unlimbering on the high ground to provide covering fire. Scarlett's command consisted of 5 regiments arranged in a compact formation that occupied perhaps 300 yards of frontage. The Scots Greys formed his first line, 300 heavy dragoons mounted on their distinctive gray horses, their bearskin caps making them appear even larger than they were. Behind them, the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons and the 5th Dragoon Guards formed the second line, with the 4th Dragoon Guards and 1st Royal Dragoons in reserve. Every man was equipped with a pattern 1821 light cavalry saber and a percussion cap carbine, though in the close quarters work Scarlett anticipated the carbines would be useless. This would be decided by cold steel and the weight of horses driven into enemy formations at the gallop. The tactical situation was stark. Russian cavalry outnumbered the heavy brigade by nearly 4-1 and held the higher ground. Conventional military doctrine called for Scarlett to refuse action, withdraw toward Balaclava, and allow the Russian force to descend into the valley where British artillery and infantry could engage them from prepared positions. But Scarlett had been a cavalryman long enough to recognize that conventional doctrine assumed both forces operated under similar conditions. The Russians were still forming as they descended the slope, their columns breaking and reforming as they navigated the uneven ground. If Scarlett charged now, immediately, while they were still in disorder, he could strike before they deployed into line and potentially disrupt their entire advance. It was a calculated risk, the kind that separated competent commanders from exceptional ones. At 8:15, Scarlett gave the order to advance. The heavy brigade moved forward at a walk, then a trot, closing the distance to the Russian cavalry in good order. The ground between them was deceptive. What appeared from a distance to be flat grassland revealed itself on closer approach to be broken by small ravines and scattered vineyard walls, the sort of minor obstacles that could break a formation's cohesion if not navigated carefully. Scarlett led from the front, as was expected of cavalry commanders in that era, with his aide-de-camp Lieutenant Alexander Elliot riding beside him and his trumpeter ready to sound commands. Behind them, 600 sabers were drawn and held at the carry, points upward, waiting for the final order that would send them into contact. To the east, watching from a position near Katakoy, Major General the Earl of Cardigan observed the heavy brigade's advance with a mixture of professional interest and personal resentment. Cardigan commanded the Light Brigade, the 4th and 13th Light Dragoons, the 8th and 11th Hussars, and the 17th Lancers, approximately 670 men arranged in 2 lines on the valley floor. Light cavalry, by doctrine, were not intended for shock action against heavy formations. They were reconnaissance troops, pursuit forces, skirmishers meant to harass and disrupt rather than engage in frontal assaults. But Cardigan was also keenly aware that his heavy brigade counterpart was about to earn glory or disaster, and he was temperamentally inclined toward the former. He wanted to support Scarlett's attack, to commit his own regiments to the battle developing on the heights. But his orders from Lord Raglan were explicit: remain in position and defend the approaches to Balaclava. Cardigan was many things: vain, abrasive, politically connected, but he was also a professional soldier who followed orders. He held his position and watched. What neither Scarlett nor Cardigan could see, obscured by the broken ground and the drifting powder smoke from Russian artillery, was the activity occurring along the northern edge of the valley, in the dead ground below the Fedyukhin heights. Multiple British cavalry vedettes, mounted sentries posted forward to provide early warning, reported unusual observations during the morning's initial Russian advance. Corporal Thomas Morley of the 17th Lancers, stationed on a small rise that provided good observation of the northern approaches, sent back a report at 7:45 describing a formed body of cavalry, strength unknown, moving west along the base of the heights in good order. He estimated their strength at 200 to 300 and noted that their uniform appeared darker than the Russian dragoon gray, almost black in the early morning light. A patrol was dispatched to investigate. A half-troop from the 13th Light Dragoons under Lieutenant Frederick Maxey, 12 men with carbines and sabers, tasked with identifying this unknown formation and determining whether it represented a flanking threat. Maxey led his patrol north at the trot, following Morley's bearing, and rode for approximately 15 minutes before halting to sweep the ground with his telescope. He saw Russian cavalry in abundance, the main body descending toward Scarlett's position, Cossack screening forces on the flanks, all clearly identifiable by uniform and formation. But of the dark cavalry Morley had reported, he found no trace. The ground where they should have been was empty. Maxey noted this in his verbal report upon return, suggesting that Morley had likely observed Cossacks whose dark cloaks had been misidentified in poor light. The incident was forgotten within minutes as the Heavy Brigade's charge began. But Morley knew what he had seen, and he was not the only one. Throughout the morning, as the Battle of Balaclava developed in phases, first the Russian capture of the Turkish redoubts on the Causeway Heights, then Scarlet's charge, and finally the confused maneuvering that would lead to the Light Brigade's doomed attack, multiple British cavalrymen reported sightings of unidentified mounted troops operating in the periphery of the main action. The reports shared common characteristics: formations of 50 to 200 riders, uniform consistently described as dark or black, movements that suggested military discipline but no apparent allegiance to either side, and a tendency to appear and disappear in ways that defied tactical logic. A sergeant of the Scots Greys, in the immediate aftermath of the Heavy Brigade's successful but costly charge, reported seeing cavalry moving through the melee, as if we weren't there, passing between our lads and the Russians without engaging either side. A trooper from the 8th Hussars claimed he had seen mounted men watching from a spur of the Fedyukin Heights, silhouetted against the sky, who vanished the moment he pointed them out to his corporal. Captain William Morris of the 17th Lancers, a steady officer with 5 years of Indian service and a reputation for reliable observation, recorded in his journal that during the morning's confused cavalry actions, he had observed on 3 separate occasions what appeared to be formed cavalry bodies, operating independently of all known forces, their purpose and allegiance entirely unclear. None of these reports were consolidated or analyzed during the battle. There was no time, no staff capacity to investigate anomalous sightings when the primary concern was coordinating attacks, managing ammunition supply, and attempting to interpret the stream of confusing and often contradictory orders arriving from Lord Raglan's command post on the Sapoon Heights. The sightings were noted, if at all, in personal journals or mentioned in passing during post-action conversations. They did not appear in official dispatches, but they accumulated, building toward a pattern that would become impossible to ignore once the day's most infamous action unfolded: the Light Brigade's charge down the valley, into the face of Russian artillery and cavalry, across ground that the local Tatars had warned was cursed, toward an objective that may not have been entirely what the British command believed they were ordering their cavalry to attack. The Heavy Brigade had won their engagement, driving the Russian cavalry back up the Fedyukin Heights in disorder after a vicious close-quarters melee that lasted perhaps 8 minutes. Scarlet's regiments had suffered 98 casualties, a significant price, but acceptable given they had routed a force 4 times their size and secured the southern valley. Now they reformed behind the Light Brigade's position, men and horses blown, sabers notched and dulled, waiting to see what the day would bring next. The Russian threat had been checked, but not eliminated. Artillery still dominated the high ground at both ends of the valley, and infantry occupied the captured Turkish redoubts along the Causeway Heights. The tactical situation remained unstable, balanced on the edge of disaster or stalemate, depending on what orders came down from Lord Raglan. Captain Lewis Nolan spent the lull riding between formations, checking on the condition of horses, and speaking with junior officers about ammunition and casualties. Nolan was an unusual figure in the British cavalry, the son of an Italian mother and British father, raised in Milan, educated in Austria. He had served in the Austrian and Hungarian armies before transferring to British service. He spoke 4 languages fluently, had written the definitive manual on cavalry training and tactics, and possessed a restless intelligence that made him impatient with the aristocratic mediocrity that dominated British cavalry command. He was also Lord Raglan's aide-de-camp for cavalry matters, which meant he would shortly be responsible for delivering what would become the most controversial order in British military history. But at 10:30, Nolan's concerns were more immediate. His mare, the same mount that had been so agitated during the night, continued to display unusual behavior. She flinched at shadows, shied from ground that appeared perfectly firm, and kept turning her head to stare at the northern end of the valley where Russian guns were positioned. Nolan was an expert horseman. He had literally written the book on the subject, and he knew the difference between a mount made nervous by battle and one reacting to something he could not perceive. This was the latter. He dismounted and ran his hands along her legs, checking for injury or strain that might explain her behavior. He found nothing. The mare was sound. She was simply afraid of something Nolan could not identify. He was not alone in observing this. Across the light brigade, horses were displaying similar responses. Some refused to face north, requiring their riders to physically turn their heads in that direction. Others pawed constantly at the ground, ears pinned back, nostrils flared. The behavior was too widespread to be coincidental and too uniform to be explained by individual temperament. Sergeant Major George Loy Smith of the 11th Hussars, a 20-year veteran with experience in the Sikh Wars, remarked to his troop sergeant that in all his service he had never seen cavalry mounts react this way, without clear cause. Usually the smell of blood or the sound of artillery had to be immediate and intense to produce this level of agitation. But the valley was relatively quiet. The Russian guns were silent, conserving ammunition. The only sounds were the wind and the distant noises of wounded men being evacuated. Yet the horses behaved as if they were about to charge into the teeth of canister fire. Lieutenant Edward Seeger of the 8th Hussars experienced something more specific. While watering his horse at a small stream that ran along the southern edge of the valley, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision, cavalry riding in formation along the base of the causeway heights, perhaps 300 yards distant. He turned to look directly at them, assuming they were British cavalry moving to new positions, and found himself staring at empty ground. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Nothing. But when he allowed his gaze to drift slightly to the side, focused on the stream, the movement returned, distinct shapes of horses and riders, a formed body, perhaps 50 strong, moving from east to west at a steady trot. The moment he looked directly at them, they ceased to exist. Seeger was 24 years old, the third son of a Devon baronet, educated at Eton and commissioned into the Hussars because it was what younger sons of good family did when the church and law held no appeal. He was not given to imagination or superstition. He was also not given to reporting observations that would make him appear unstable or unreliable. So he said nothing, remounted his horse, and returned to his squadron. But he noted the incident in his diary that evening, carefully recording the time, location, and nature of what he had observed. The entry concludes, "Cannot account for this phenomenon." The ground was clearly visible and unoccupied when viewed directly, yet peripheral observation suggested formed cavalry present in strength. Fatigue and strain of campaign may be affecting perception. Must monitor for recurrence. The phenomenon did recur across multiple independent witnesses throughout the morning. A trooper from the 4th Light Dragoons reported seeing phantom riders near the site of the Heavy Brigade's earlier charge, cavalry in dark uniforms, moving among the wounded and dead, not looting, but simply riding through as if inspecting the aftermath of battle. When he rode closer to investigate, they were gone. A corporal of the 17th Lancers, moving up to the forward picket line, encountered what he described as a procession of mounted men, crossing his front at perhaps 200 yards distance, their formation so precise and their movement so steady that he initially assumed they must be a ceremonial guard or honor escort. But ceremonial guards did not appear on active battlefields, and when he mentioned the sighting to his sergeant, the older man told him to keep such observations to himself unless he wanted to be sent to the rear for medical observation. The most detailed account from this period came from Cornet George Wombwell of the 17th Lancers, 19 years old and experiencing his first major engagement. Wombwell had been detached from his regiment to serve as a galloper, a mounted courier responsible for carrying messages between commanders, and spent much of the morning riding between Lord Cardigan's position and the various regimental commanders. At approximately 11 o'clock, while returning from delivering a routine status report, he encountered a full squadron of cavalry occupying a position that should have been empty. They were formed in line, facing north toward the Russian positions, motionless and silent. Their uniforms were black or very dark blue, certainly not British scarlet or the lighter shades worn by Russian cavalry. Their horses were uniformly dark, and their equipment appeared old-fashioned, harking back to an earlier period of cavalry warfare. Wombwell reined in his horse and called out in English, asking which regiment they belonged to. No response. He tried again in French, the lingua franca of European officers. Still nothing. The formation simply sat there, as substantial as any cavalry he had ever seen, yet somehow wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. The light fell on them strangely, as if they existed in slightly different weather than the surrounding landscape. And there was no sound, no breathing from horses that should have been audible at 50 yards, no creak of leather, no jingle of bits and stirrups. Just absolute silence and absolute stillness. He was about to ride forward to investigate when his horse violently refused, rearing and nearly throwing him. When he regained control and looked back at the formation, they were gone. Not dispersed, not ridden away, simply absent, as if they had never existed. The ground where they had been standing was undisturbed. Wombwell sat his horse for perhaps 30 seconds, trying to reconcile what he had just experienced with any rational explanation. Then he spurred his mount and rode back to Lord Cardigan's position at considerably more speed than the message he was carrying warranted. He did not report the incident. He was 19 years old and terrified that speaking of it would result in him being relieved of duty and sent back to England in disgrace. By noon, as the battle entered its next phase, and Lord Raglan prepared to issue the order that would send the Light Brigade into history, perhaps 24 British cavalrymen had witnessed some version of the Shadow Cavalry. None of them had spoken openly about it. None of them had filed official reports. But in the small conversations that occur in any military unit during lulls in combat, the brief exchanges between men watering horses, checking equipment, or sharing tobacco, the pattern was emerging. Something was present in the valley that did not belong to either army, something that appeared most clearly in peripheral vision or in moments of distraction, something that moved with military precision but engaged in no combat, acknowledged no living soldiers, and vanished the moment direct attention was paid to it. The Tatar warning about Gulga Atlalar had been accurate. There were shadow riders in the valley north of Balaclava, and as the Light Brigade prepared to receive what would be the most infamous order in British military history, those shadow riders were massing in strength, drawn to the approaching catastrophe like witnesses to an execution they had observed countless times before. The order that Captain Lewis Nolan carried down from the Sapoon Heights was ambiguous in its wording and catastrophic in its consequences. Lord Raglan, observing from 600 feet above the valley floor, had watched Russian forces beginning to remove the captured British naval guns from the redoubts along the Causeway Heights. To prevent this, he directed his quartermaster general to write an order for the cavalry to advance and prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. The written order, delivered to Nolan at approximately 11 o'clock, read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate." From Raglan's elevated position, the guns in question, the British naval guns captured earlier that morning, were clearly visible on the Causeway Heights. But from the valley floor, where Lord Lucan commanded the cavalry division and Lord Cardigan commanded the Light Brigade, those guns were not visible at all. What was visible at the far eastern end of the valley was a different battery entirely. Russian field artillery positioned to create a killing zone, supported by infantry on the Causeway Heights to the south and the Fedyukin Heights to the north, with 3,000 Russian cavalry in reserve behind the guns. When Lukin received the order and questioned its meaning, Nolan, frustrated by what he perceived as deliberate obstruction and delay, pointed vaguely toward the eastern end of the valley and said, according to multiple witnesses, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." Lukin, given a direct order from the commander-in-chief and a specific indication from the officer who had delivered it, had no choice but to comply. He passed the order to Cardigan, who protested immediately that advancing down the valley would expose his brigade to fire from 3 sides and result in annihilation. Lukin acknowledged this, but repeated that the order had come directly from Raglan and must be obeyed. Cardigan, whatever his personal faults, was a professional cavalry officer who understood both his duty and the tactical reality he faced. He replied, "Certainly, sir, but allow me to point out to you that the Russians have a battery in the valley on our front and batteries and riflemen on both sides." Lukin's response has been recorded by multiple sources. "I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey." At 11:10, the Light Brigade formed for the advance. The first line consisted of the 13th Light Dragoons on the right and the 17th Lancers on the left, with a total frontage of approximately 400 yards. The second line, positioned 150 yards behind, consisted of the 11th Hussars in the center, flanked by the 4th and 8th Light Dragoons. Lord Cardigan positioned himself at the head of the first line, mounted on his chestnut charger Ronald, wearing the distinctive uniform of the 11th Hussars with its cherry-colored trousers and heavily braided dolman. Behind the brigade, Captain William Brandling's C Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery unlimbered their 6 9-pounder guns, ready to provide supporting fire, though they would be massively outgunned by the Russian batteries. The distance to be covered was approximately 1 mile and 200 yards across open ground with a gentle upward slope toward the Russian positions. The valley floor was broken by small vineyards and scattered rocks, enough to disrupt formation cohesion, but not enough to provide cover. Russian artillery dominated both flanks, 12 guns on the Causeway Heights to the south, 14 guns on the Fedyukin Heights to the north, and 12 guns at the eastern end of the valley directly in their path. If all 38 guns fired canister at close range, essentially giant shotgun blasts of metal balls, into a concentrated cavalry formation moving at the gallop, the mathematical result was not in doubt. The Light Brigade would be destroyed as an effective fighting force. The only question was how many would survive to reach the Russian guns. At 11:17, Lord Cardigan gave the order to walk march forward. The Light Brigade moved out in perfect formation, 670 men maintaining precise dressing as they advanced down the valley. The pace was deliberately slow. Cavalry doctrine called for preserving the horse's stamina until the final charge, when speed would be essential to close with the enemy before artillery could deliver maximum effect. For the first 300 yards, the brigade advanced in complete silence except for the rhythmic thud of hooves and the jingle of equipment. Russian gunners watched them come, adjusting their aim, waiting for the range to close. This was the killing ground, and both sides knew it. It was during this initial advance, before the Russian guns opened fire, that the shadow cavalry appeared in force. Private Samuel Parks of the 4th Light Dragoons, riding in the second line, later testified that he saw cavalry formations moving parallel to the Light Brigade's advance on both flanks. Dark riders in archaic uniforms, perhaps 200 strong on each side, matching the brigade's pace exactly. He assumed initially they were French cavalry, promised in Raglan's order, but not yet visible, come to support the advance. But the uniforms were wrong, and the formations were wrong, and they were moving through ground that he knew was under direct observation from Russian artillery without drawing any fire. Sergeant Talbot of the 17th Lancers experienced something more unsettling. Riding in the first line, he became aware of riders immediately to his left, so close he could have reached out and touched them. maintaining perfect interval as if part of his own squadron. But when he glanced sideways to see which of his comrades had moved out of position, he saw horses and riders that were not part of the 17th Lancers. Their uniforms were black, their equipment older in style, and the faces were wrong. Not disfigured or monstrous, but absent somehow, as if the riders existed, but the men inside the uniforms did not. He looked forward again, focused on Lord Cardigan's back, and did not look sideways for the rest of the charge. Then the Russian guns opened fire. The first salvo came from the battery at the eastern end of the valley at a range of approximately 1,200 yards, too distant for canister, so they fired solid shot and shell designed to ricochet through the formation or explode overhead. The sound was immense, a rolling thunder that echoed off the valley walls and caused horses to flinch despite their training. The first rounds fell short, throwing up geysers of earth and rock. The gunners adjusted their aim. The second salvo struck the Light Brigade's formation directly. Private John Vahey of the 17th Lancers, riding in the front rank, saw the trooper to his right, a man named Dudley, simply disappear as a solid iron ball took his head and shoulders away. The horse continued for another 20 yards before collapsing. The formation closed ranks and continued forward. Lord Cardigan increased the pace to a trot at approximately 800 yards from the Russian guns. This was the critical moment, slow enough to preserve the horses, but fast enough to minimize exposure to artillery fire. The brigade's formation began to waver as casualties mounted and gaps appeared in the lines. Officers and NCOS shouted to maintain dressing, to keep the formation tight, but artillery was a mathematics problem that courage could not solve. Every 100 yards they advanced, the Russian fire became more accurate and more devastating. The guns on both flanks opened up, enfilading the brigade from the causeway and Fedyukin heights. Men and horses went down in clusters, entire sections wiped out by single shells. The ground behind the advancing cavalry became carpeted with bodies, dead and wounded men, horses thrashing in their death agonies, equipment scattered across the valley floor. And through this carnage, multiple survivors would later report the Shadow Cavalry continued their advance. They moved through the artillery fire untouched, passing between living British cavalrymen as if occupying the same space but existing in some parallel version of the same moment. Cornet Wombwell, who had encountered them earlier, saw them again during the advance. Entire squadrons of dark riders moving in perfect formation while the light brigade around them disintegrated under Russian fire. They did not fall. They did not bleed. They simply rode forward with the same steady purpose they had shown all morning, as if the artillery was irrelevant to whatever mission they were executing. Private John Penn of the 17th Lancers found himself riding beside one of them for perhaps 15 seconds as the brigade accelerated to a canter. The Shadow Rider was mounted on a black horse, wore a uniform Penn did not recognize, and carried a straight sword of a pattern that predated the curved saber by decades. Penn could see him with perfect clarity, the details of his equipment, the way he sat his horse, the expression of absolute focus on his face. But there was no sound from him, no breathing, no movement of equipment, no impact of hooves on the ground. And when a Russian shell exploded directly behind them, throwing up dirt and rocks that struck Penn's back and made his horse stumble, the Shadow Rider was not affected at all. The debris passed through him as if he were made of smoke. Then the Light Brigade surged forward at the gallop for the final charge, and Penn lost sight of him in the chaos. At 600 yards, Lord Cardigan increased to a gallop. This was the point of no return. The horses were now fully committed, running at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour directly toward artillery positions that were firing canister at point-blank range. The noise was beyond description, the roar of guns, the screams of wounded men and horses, the thunder of hundreds of hooves, the whistling of incoming rounds, and beneath it all, reported by at least a dozen survivors, another sound entirely. a rhythmic pounding that didn't match the Light Brigade's advance, deeper and more resonant, as if a much larger cavalry force was charging alongside them, but slightly out of phase with observable reality. Some described it as an echo, others as the sound of cavalry from beneath the ground. All agreed it was present and distinct from the sounds of their own advance. The shadow cavalry were no longer peripheral. They were everywhere. Formations hundreds strong, moving through and around the Light Brigade, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but always present. And as the Light Brigade closed the final 200 yards to the Russian guns, as canister began to tear through their ranks with industrial efficiency, as men and horses fell by the dozen, and the formation finally broke apart into a mob of individual riders simply trying to reach the enemy before they were killed, the shadow cavalry reached the Russian position first. They arrived seconds before the leading British troopers, riding directly into the Russian battery, and for just a moment, a single frozen instant reported by multiple witnesses on both sides, the Russian gunners stopped firing. They stood motionless, staring at something advancing toward them that was not the British cavalry, something older and darker and utterly silent. Then the moment passed, the guns resumed firing, and the Light Brigade crashed into the Russian position in a final desperate melee that would last less than 5 minutes but would echo through military history for more than a century. The first British cavalrymen to reach the Russian guns were from the 17th Lancers, perhaps 70 men out of the 145 who had started the charge. They came through the final curtain of canister fire like riders emerging from hell, their uniforms torn and bloodied, their horses foam-covered and heaving, their lances leveled at the Russian gunners, who had perhaps 3 seconds to realize that the cavalry they thought they had destroyed was now among them. Captain William Morris led the charge into the battery position itself, his lance taking a Russian artillery officer through the chest before the shaft splintered. He drew his saber and continued forward, cutting down a gunner who was attempting to load canister into a piece that would have fired directly into the follow-on British cavalry. Behind the Lancers came elements of the 13th Light Dragoons and the 11th Hussars, perhaps another 100 men, the survivors of the first and second lines, now intermixed and fighting as individuals rather than formations. Lord Cardigan himself reached the guns, rode through the battery position without engaging, a decision that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life, and continued east toward the Russian cavalry reserve. Some accounts suggest he believed his duty was to lead, not to fight. Others suggest he simply did not comprehend that the charge had reached its objective and the withdrawal would need to be organized. Regardless, Cardigan rode on alone while his brigade fought for their lives in the battery position behind him. The melee that followed was brief and vicious. Russian gunners fought with handspikes and rammers, the only weapons they possessed. British cavalry used sabers and the last remnants of their lances, hacking at men who stood their ground because there was nowhere to retreat. Horses, maddened by wounds and exhaustion, bit and kicked everything within reach. The ground became slick with blood. The air filled with gunpowder smoke so thick that visibility dropped to a few yards. Men killed enemies they never clearly saw, died from wounds they never felt coming, fought with the mechanical brutality of soldiers who understood that stopping meant death. It was in this chaos that the shadow cavalry manifested most clearly. Multiple British survivors reported that the Russian battery position became impossibly crowded, that there were more cavalry present than could physically fit in the space available, that riders in black or very dark blue uniforms moved through the melee without engaging either side, that wounded men lying on the ground watched formations of cavalry ride over them without the horses' hooves making contact. Sergeant Major Loy Smith of the 11th Hussars, engaged in single combat with a Russian gunner, saw cavalry moving past him at a distance of perhaps 10 feet, a formed body of at least 50 riders advancing in column through ground that he knew was occupied by dead horses and struggling men. They passed without disturbing anything, without acknowledging the battle occurring around them, as silent and purposeful as a funeral procession. Private James Whiteman of the 17th Lancers, dismounted when his horse was killed beneath him, found himself standing among the shadow cavalry as clearly as he stood among his own regiment. They surrounded him, riders on horses that cast no shadows despite the midday sun, cavalry whose uniforms he could not quite focus on even when looking directly at them, formations that seemed to exist in his peripheral vision even when he stared straight ahead. He could smell them, or rather, he could smell an absence, a cold emptiness where the scent of horses and leather and human sweat should have been. One of them rode past close enough that Whiteman reached out instinctively to steady himself against the horse's flank. His hand passed through the animal as if through cold water. The sensation lasted only a moment, but he would describe it decades later as the most terrifying experience of the entire charge. Not the artillery fire or the hand-to-hand combat, but that single moment of physical contact with something that should not exist. The Russian perspective provided corroboration from an entirely different cultural and linguistic framework. Colonel Dzerzhinsky, commanding a regiment of Don Cossacks positioned behind the battery, observed the British breakthrough with professional interest. He had expected the charge to be stopped before reaching the guns, and he was impressed by the courage and discipline required to execute it. But he also observed something that did not fit his tactical understanding of the engagement. In his report filed 3 days after the battle, he noted that the British cavalry appeared to be accompanied by mounted forces of unknown origin and unclear allegiance, dark riders in non-standard uniform who moved through the battery position without engaging our troops. He estimated their strength at 200 to 300 and noted that they seemed to precede the British attack, arriving at the guns moments before the light brigade itself. This observation was corroborated by multiple Russian artillerymen. A gunner named Grigoriev, interviewed by Russian staff officers compiling after-action reports, stated that he had ceased firing in the final moments before the British reached his gun because he saw cavalry already in the battery position, cavalry that was neither British nor Russian, cavalry that simply appeared among the guns without having crossed the killing ground of the valley. He assumed they were some sort of advance guard or specialized unit he did not recognize. When the British charge arrived seconds later, the unknown cavalry vanished, and Grigoriev found himself fighting the 17th Lancers. He was badly wounded in the melee and captured. He repeated his account to British officers who questioned him, adding that the Dark Riders were a known phenomenon among local Tatar civilians, who called them Ulu Atlalar, the Dead Riders. The fighting at the guns lasted approximately 4 minutes before the surviving British cavalry were forced to withdraw. They were outnumbered, surrounded on 3 sides, and taking fire from Russian infantry on the heights. Lord George Paget, commanding the 4th Light Dragoons, attempted to organize a fighting retreat, but organization was impossible in the smoke and chaos. The withdrawal became a running fight back down the valley, with Russian cavalry pursuing and the British guns firing canister that made no distinction between friend and enemy in the confusion. Men made their own decisions about when to run and which direction to go. Some rode north toward the Fedyukin Heights, attempting to escape the artillery fire from the flanks. Others rode south toward the Causeway Heights. Most followed the valley back west toward their starting positions, running a gauntlet of fire that was as deadly as the advance had been. Private Parks of the 4th Light Dragoons, who had observed shadow cavalry during the advance, saw them again during the retreat. He was riding beside Trumpet Major Crawford when Crawford's horse was shot, throwing him to the ground in the path of pursuing Russian cavalry. Parks turned back, an act of courage that would earn him the Victoria Cross, and pulled Crawford onto his own horse, which then carried both men at a laboring gallop back toward British lines. But as they rode, Parks became aware that they were not alone. Dark Riders flanked them on both sides, matching their pace, forming a protective corridor through which Russian cavalry seemed reluctant to pursue. Parks could not see them clearly, His attention was focused on controlling his overburdened horse and watching for threats, but he could sense them, could hear hoofbeats that did not match his own mount's rhythm, could feel the presence of something riding alongside him in the smoke and chaos. When he finally reached British lines and dismounted Crawford, he turned to look back at the valley and saw the shadow cavalry one final time. Formations riding through the scattered remains of the Light Brigade, moving among the dead and wounded with the deliberate purpose of searchers or witnesses, utterly untouched by the artillery fire that still swept the ground. The last man to leave the Russian battery position was Captain Louis Edward Nolan, the same officer who had delivered the ambiguous order, who had ridden with the Light Brigade when he should have returned to Lord Raglan, who may have been attempting to redirect the charge when he was killed. Nolan had been struck by a shell fragment during the advance, approximately 200 yards from the Russian guns. The wound was immediately fatal. The fragment had torn through his chest and likely killed him instantly. But his body remained in the saddle, his arm raised and pointing, his horse carrying him forward with the charge until the animal finally stopped among the Russian guns. British troopers who reached the battery found Nolan's body still mounted, his face locked in what witnesses described as an expression of absolute horror. His arm still raised and pointing not at the Russian guns, but at something beyond them, something to the north where the shadow cavalry had been most heavily concentrated. Surgeon James Mowat examined Nolan's body after it was recovered. The physical wound was straightforward. The shell fragment had caused massive internal trauma, and death would have been effectively instantaneous. But Mowat noted in his medical report something he could not explain. Nolan's eyes were open, and the expression on his face was not consistent with a man killed suddenly in battle. It was the expression of someone who had seen something in that final moment before death that had terrified him beyond the normal fear of dying. Mowat, a rational man of science trained in Edinburgh and experienced in battlefield medicine, noted this observation but drew no conclusions. He simply recorded that Captain Nolan's expression suggested an encounter with phenomena beyond standard combat experience, and left it at that. By 11:45, 28 minutes after the charge began, the surviving members of the Light Brigade had returned to their starting position. Of the 670 men who had advanced down the valley, 195 returned, many of them wounded. The Light Brigade had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. They had achieved nothing of tactical significance. The Russian guns they had reached were not the guns Lord Raglan had ordered them to capture, and the battery they had briefly overrun was back in Russian hands within minutes of their withdrawal. By any conventional military analysis, the charge of the Light Brigade was a catastrophic failure born of confused orders, inadequate reconnaissance, and the limitations of command and control in mid-19th century warfare. But the survivors brought back accounts that transcended tactical analysis. Accounts of cavalry that should not have been present, of riders that moved through artillery fire unharmed, of formations that appeared and vanished according to no military logic. Accounts that were remarkably consistent across multiple independent witnesses from different regiments, different ranks, different positions in the charge. Accounts that were corroborated, however imperfectly, by Russian prisoners who spoke of Ulu Atlalar and refused to return to the valley even under guard. Accounts that the British command would systematically suppress, file, and eventually classify because they could not be explained and could not be ignored, and because speaking of them threatened to undermine the carefully constructed narrative of courage and tragedy that the charge of the Light Brigade would become in British national mythology. The valley at dawn presented a scene of systematic devastation. The ground where the Light Brigade had charged was carpeted with debris, dead horses in clusters where canister had swept through formations, scattered equipment ranging from helmets to sabers to the shredded remains of uniforms, shell craters still smoking slightly in the morning cold. British burial parties moved among the wreckage, identifying bodies when possible, stripping them of personal effects to be returned to families, then carrying them to mass graves being excavated near the British positions. The work was grim and methodical, conducted in near silence, except for the necessary exchanges between men coordinating the removal of bodies too heavy for one person to manage alone. Captain Godfrey Morgan of the 17th Lancers, one of the few officers who had ridden the entire length of the valley and returned unwounded, supervised a burial detail working the area where his regiment had suffered the highest casualties. Morgan was 24 years old, had purchased his commission 3 years earlier, and had never witnessed anything approaching the carnage that surrounded him. He moved through the work with mechanical efficiency, recording names when identification was possible, noting position and condition of bodies for the official casualty reports that would be compiled later. But he also noticed anomalies that did not fit the expected pattern of battlefield casualties. Several bodies were found in locations that made no tactical sense, British cavalrymen who had somehow ended up north of the valley floor, in ground that should have been impossible to reach during the charge. Others showed wounds that did not match Russian weapons. One trooper from the 13th Light Dragoons was found with what appeared to be lance wounds, despite the fact that Russian cavalry had not carried lances during the battle. Another had saber cuts that angled incorrectly for mounted combat, downward from shoulder to hip, as if delivered by a rider mounted on a horse substantially taller than any in service with either army. Morgan documented these observations in his personal journal, but did not include them in official reports, uncertain what conclusions could be drawn from them. The most disturbing discoveries came from the eastern end of the valley, near the Russian battery position where the melee had occurred. A work party from the 4th Light Dragoons, detailed to recover British dead from the battery itself, found bodies that had been dead for considerably longer than 24 hours. A sergeant named Bentley, supervising the detail, reported to Morgan that they had uncovered remains dressed in uniforms he did not recognize. Cavalry uniforms certainly, but of a pattern that predated the Crimean War by decades or possibly centuries. The bodies themselves were in various states of preservation, some skeletal, others appearing recently dead despite their archaic equipment. Bentley requested guidance on how to handle these remains. Were they British, Russian, Ottoman? He could not determine allegiance or even approximate date of death. Morgan rode to the battery position to investigate personally. What he found troubled him enough that he immediately requested the presence of the regimental surgeon and the provost marshal. The remains Bentley had described were there, approximately 30 bodies in various states of decay, all wearing cavalry uniforms, that Morgan's knowledge of military history suggested dated from the late 17th to early 18th century. Some wore armor pieces that had not been standard issue for cavalry in any European army since before the Napoleonic Wars. Their equipment was genuine, not reproduction, sabers forged using techniques no longer employed, saddles constructed in patterns that modern cavalry had abandoned, horse furniture decorated with heraldic devices that Morgan could not identify. Surgeon Henry Wilkin examined several of the bodies at Morgan's request. His findings, recorded in a medical report dated October the 27th that would remain classified for more than a century, were precise and troubling. The bodies showed evidence of death by violence, saber wounds, lance punctures, blunt trauma consistent with combat. But they also showed evidence of having been dead for extended periods, in some cases decades or longer, based on the degree of skeletal exposure and the degradation of organic materials. Yet they had been found on the surface, not buried, lying among British and Russian dead from the previous day's battle, as if they had fallen at the same time. Wilkin could offer no explanation that reconciled these observations with known physical principles. He recommended that the remains be interred separately and that their discovery be noted in official records without speculation about their origin or significance. This recommendation was not followed. Instead, the bodies were buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the battlefield, their equipment collected and sent to rear area storage, and all documentation relating to their discovery was classified. The work parties who had handled the remains were instructed not to discuss what they had found, with the threat of military discipline for anyone who spoke of the matter. Within a week, the incident had been effectively suppressed, existing only in scattered journal entries, private letters, and classified reports that would not be declassified until the 21st century. But the phenomenon itself continued. Throughout the winter of 1854 to 1855, as the siege of Sevastopol ground on and British forces remained encamped near Balaclava, sightings of the shadow cavalry persisted. Sentries reported mounted patrols moving through the valley at night, formations that did not respond to challenges, that vanished when approached, that left no tracks in the mud and snow. Cavalry vedettes posted forward to watch for Russian activity reported encounters with riders who could not be identified as friend or enemy, who appeared most clearly in twilight or dawn, who seemed to follow routes through the valley that did not correspond to any current tactical requirement. Private William Pennington of the 11th Hussars, on sentry duty in late November, encountered a full squadron of cavalry riding through his post at approximately 3 in the morning. He challenged them repeatedly in English and French, received no response, and finally fired a warning shot that passed directly through the leading rider without apparent effect. The formation continued past him at a steady walk, close enough that he could have touched them if he had dared, and disappeared into the darkness toward the eastern end of the valley. Pennington reported the incident to his sergeant, was placed under arrest for firing without authorization, and spent 3 days in confinement before being released with a reprimand. He did not report any subsequent sightings, though his journal suggests he continued to see the shadow cavalry regularly until his unit was rotated away from Balaclava in February 1855. The Tatar civilian population, those few who remained in the area after the British occupation, provided context that the military authorities refused to consider seriously. An elderly Tatar farmer named Mehmet, employed as a translator and guide by British intelligence officers, explained through an interpreter that the valley had been a battleground for as long as oral tradition extended. Mongol cavalry had fought there in the 13th century against combined Rus and Kipchak forces. Ottoman and Russian cavalry had clashed there repeatedly during the wars of the 18th century. Before that, Byzantine and Khazar cavalry, and before them others whose names had been forgotten. Each battle had left its dead, and the dead had never departed. They rode still, Mehmet explained, bound to the ground by the violence of their deaths, condemned or perhaps obligated to witness every subsequent battle fought on the same cursed earth. The British officers who heard this explanation dismissed it as local superstition, the sort of folklore that accumulates in any region with a long history of warfare. They were concerned with immediate tactical problems, logistics, weather, disease, not with ghost stories. But some recorded what Mehmet had said, preserving it in journals and letters that would provide valuable context decades later when researchers attempted to understand the pattern of anomalous observations surrounding the Battle of Balaclava. Mehmet himself disappeared in December 1854, possibly dead from disease or cold, possibly simply departed from a region that he knew would consume many more lives before the war ended. By spring of 1855, as the siege of Sevastopol entered its final phase and the cavalry operations near Balaclava diminished in frequency, the sightings became less common. Not absent, they continued sporadically throughout the war and would recur in later conflicts, but less intense, as if the shadow cavalry had withdrawn to whatever liminal space they occupied when not manifesting during active combat. The valley returned to its normal state, a stretch of agricultural land scarred by war but slowly recovering. The mass graves were marked, then gradually forgotten. The equipment recovered from the unidentified bodies disappeared into military storage facilities, cataloged under vague descriptions that concealed their true nature. The official history of the Battle of Balaclava, when it was written, made no mention of shadow cavalry, anomalous remains, or any phenomena that could not be explained within the rational framework of mid-19th century military science. But the survivors remembered, and when they gathered in later years at regimental dinners or veterans associations, when the wine had flowed and the official toasts had been drunk and the conversation turned to personal memories rather than public history, some of them would speak carefully about what they had seen in the valley north of Balaclava. They would describe the dark riders who had accompanied them through the charge, the cavalry that moved through artillery fire unharmed, the formations that appeared and vanished according to no military logic they understood. And they would find, almost always, that others had seen the same things, that the shadow cavalry of the Crimean War were not hallucination or individual delusion, but a shared experience, witnessed by dozens of credible observers under circumstances that left little room for misinterpretation. The official record of the Battle of Balaclava is exhaustive. The charge of the Light Brigade has been analyzed by military historians, commemorated in poetry and art, studied at staff colleges as an example of courage under catastrophic command failure. Every aspect of the battle has been documented: the confused orders, the tactical situation, the casualties, the individual acts of heroism that earned Victoria Crosses for survivors. The bibliography of works examining this single engagement runs to hundreds of volumes. Yet nowhere in this vast documentary record, until very recently, did any official publication acknowledge the consistent pattern of anomalous observations reported by multiple credible witnesses from both sides of the conflict. This silence was not accidental. Within weeks of the battle, a systematic effort began to suppress accounts that could not be explained within conventional military frameworks. The process was more subtle than at Waterloo. By 1854, the British Army had developed more sophisticated information management practices, and the presence of war correspondence and the telegraph meant that suppression had to be accomplished through classification and selective editing rather than simple archival neglect. Reports containing references to unexplained cavalry formations were marked as sensitive and routed to military intelligence offices rather than being incorporated into standard after-action compilations. Personal journals were reviewed when donated to regimental archives, with problematic passages sometimes removed before the documents were made available to researchers. The first clear evidence of official suppression appears in a memorandum dated November 15, 1854, written by Lieutenant General Sir James Simpson, then serving as Chief of Staff to Lord Raglan. The memo, discovered in 1998 in previously classified War Office files, instructs subordinate commanders to ensure that all reports concerning unexplained phenomena observed during recent cavalry actions at Balaclava be forwarded directly to headquarters for review and appropriate handling. It goes on to note that such observations, while made in good faith by officers and men of proven reliability, cannot be included in official histories without inviting speculation that would undermine public confidence in military reporting. The memo effectively established a parallel documentation system, one for conventional battle reports that would be made public, and another for anomalous observations that would be classified indefinitely. This parallel system captured a remarkable amount of material. The classified files on Balaclava, partially declassified in stages between 1998 and 2014, contain more than 300 pages of witness statements, medical reports, intelligence assessments, and correspondence relating to the shadow cavalry phenomenon. The witnesses include not just enlisted men whose testimony might be dismissed as unreliable, but officers of field-grade rank, medical personnel, and even war correspondents who observed the phenomenon but were discouraged from reporting it publicly. William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent whose dispatches from Crimea helped establish modern war journalism, wrote in a private letter to his editor about cavalry of unknown origin observed during the Light Brigade's charge. But this observation never appeared in his published dispatches. The letter, preserved in the Times archive, suggests he was advised by military authorities that including such material would damage his credibility and potentially result in loss of access to British forces. The Russian documentation, when it became accessible after the Soviet Union's collapse, provided unexpected corroboration. Soviet military historians compiling a comprehensive study of the Crimean War in the 1970s encountered numerous references in Russian archival material to Zagadachne Cavalry, mysterious cavalry observed during the Battle of Balaclava. Witnesses included Colonel Dzerzhinsky, whose report has already been mentioned, but also junior officers, enlisted men, and Tatar civilians employed by Russian forces. The Soviet historians, working within a materialist framework that had no room for unexplained phenomena, initially assumed these reports reflected confusion during combat or perhaps deliberate deception by enemy forces. But the consistency of the observations, their correlation with British accounts that the Soviet researchers could not have known about due to classification, and the inclusion of similar reports from other battles fought in the same region, eventually forced them to acknowledge that something genuinely anomalous had been observed. Their conclusion, buried in an internal Ministry of Defense report that was not intended for public release, was cautious but significant. Multiple independent witnesses from opposing forces operating under different cultural and ideological frameworks reported observations consistent with the hypothesis that certain geographic locations may retain or replay aspects of previous military engagements through mechanisms not currently understood by Soviet science. While we cannot endorse supernatural explanations, we cannot dismiss the possibility that some form of electromagnetic or psychological phenomenon operates in these locations. Recommend continued monitoring and additional research. This recommendation was not implemented. The Soviet Union collapsed before any systematic study could be organized, and the Russian military that succeeded it had more immediate concerns than investigating ghost cavalry from the 19th century. But the documentation remained, and when it became accessible to Western researchers in the late 1990s, it provided crucial evidence that the shadow cavalry of Balaclava were not an artifact of British psychology or culture, but a genuine phenomenon observed across linguistic, national, and ideological boundaries. Academic interest in the phenomenon remained marginal until 2006, when Dr. Sarah Kensington of the University of Leeds published a comprehensive study titled Anomalous Cavalry Observations at Balaclava, a Multi-Source Analysis. Kensington had spent 8 years collecting declassified documents, interviewing descendants of Crimean War veterans, and researching Tatar oral histories. Her work demonstrated that the shadow cavalry observations fit within a much larger pattern of anomalous phenomena reported from the Crimean Peninsula extending back to at least the 13th century. She documented more than 70 separate incidents of unexplained cavalry sightings in the region, occurring during the Mongol invasions, the Ottoman-Russian Wars, World War I, World War II, and even during the recent Russo-Ukrainian conflicts in Crimea. The pattern Kensington identified suggested that certain geographic features, particularly valleys that had served as cavalry approach routes for centuries, appeared to retain or replay aspects of previous battles under specific conditions. These conditions included active military operations in the vicinity, atmospheric phenomena such as fog or smoke, and times of day when light levels were transitional. The shadow cavalry appeared most reliably during battles, manifesting to witnesses on both sides of the conflict, moving through combat zones without engaging either force, following routes that corresponded to historical cavalry movements from previous wars. They were, Kensington proposed, not ghosts in any traditional supernatural sense, but rather some form of environmental recording, events imprinted onto the landscape through the intense electromagnetic and emotional energy of cavalry warfare, replayed under conditions that approximated the original circumstances. This theory remains controversial and unproven. Subsequent researchers have proposed alternative explanations, ranging from collective hallucination induced by combat stress to classified military technology being tested without the knowledge of field commanders, to genuine paranormal phenomena involving the spirits of deceased cavalry. No explanation has achieved consensus, and the official position of the British Ministry of Defense remains that the anomalous observations reported from Balaclava reflect the confusion inherent in combat and should not be interpreted as evidence of unexplained phenomena. But the sightings continue. In 1941, Soviet cavalry operating in Crimea during the German invasion reported encounters with unidentified mounted forces that vanished when approached. In 1944, German troops retreating through the Balaclava region described being shadowed by cavalry formations that their officers could not identify and that disappeared when reinforcements were sent to investigate. In 2014, during the Russian annexation of Crimea, Ukrainian soldiers posted video footage to social media showing what appeared to be cavalry moving across open ground near the site of the 1854 charge, footage that was extensively analyzed and determined to be genuine, not computer-generated or manipulated, but showing something that should not exist according to known physical principles. The most recent documented encounter occurred in October 2019 during a British Army staff ride of the Balaclava battlefield, an educational exercise where current officers walk the terrain to understand the tactical decisions made during historical battles. A group of 12 officers, accompanied by a civilian historian specializing in the Crimean War, were mapping the route of the Light Brigade's charge when all 13 witnesses simultaneously observed cavalry moving through the valley. The sighting lasted approximately 45 seconds and was captured on multiple cell phone cameras. The footage shows indistinct mounted figures moving in formation across ground that was demonstrably empty when the area was physically searched immediately after the sighting. The incident was reported through proper channels and investigated by military police and intelligence personnel. The investigation concluded that the witnesses were credible, the footage was genuine, and no conventional explanation could account for the observations. The report recommended that future staff rides of the Balaclava battlefield include briefings on the historical pattern of anomalous cavalry sightings, and that witnesses be encouraged to document any similar observations. This recommendation marks a subtle but significant shift in official policy, from outright suppression to cautious acknowledgement that something unexplained occurs regularly at this location and should be treated as a persistent phenomenon requiring documentation rather than denial. The shadow cavalry ride still, as they have ridden for centuries. The valley north of Balaclava remains what it has always been, a corridor for mounted warfare, a killing ground where cavalry have charged and died across multiple wars, multiple empires, multiple technological eras, and the cavalry who fell there, if the witnesses can be believed, have never entirely departed. They continue their eternal patrol, bound to the ground by the violence of their deaths or by some principle of physics we do not yet understand, manifesting most clearly when the conditions approach those of historical battles, when smoke drifts across the valley, when armed forces mass on the surrounding heights, when the light is uncertain and the boundary between past and present becomes permeable. The file remains open. The phenomenon continues. And somewhere in government archives in London and Moscow, reports continue to accumulate. Careful, clinical documentation of cavalry that should not exist, witnessed by credible observers under circumstances that leave little room for misinterpretation. The shadow cavalry of the Crimean War are neither myth nor metaphor. They are a persistent anomaly, a pattern that repeats with remarkable consistency across languages, cultures, and centuries, riding forever through battles that never truly end on ground that never forgets the blood it has consumed.